Hello everyone, this is the 10th edition of the Tiny Talks. Today we're going to talk about cyber infrastructures. Tiny Talks are brief, informal talks between researchers invited by the University of Aveiro and researchers from the University of Aveiro itself through the American Corner program on topics such as technologies, innovation, research and culture. The conversations will usually take place at the University's American Corner MediaLab with the support of the US Embassy in Portugal. I want to give a warm welcome to both our guests today. Dr. Jonathan Crabtree is a director for cyber infrastructures, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Odom Institute for Research in Social Science, co-leader Global Dataverse Community Consortium, and the president of the International Federation of Data Organizations. Dr. Claudio Teixeira is Computer Science PhD in Engineering by the University of Aveiro, and he is the current Director of the Information and Communication Technology Services here at our university. Myself, I'm Diogo Gomes. I'm professor here at the Department of Electronics, Telecommunications, Informatics. I've mostly worked in several research projects EU-funded on telecommunication infrastructures, and I'm pleased here to be hosting this tiny talk with my two colleagues. And to start this topic, I would like to ask Jonathan a question. So, the academic research process guides important decisions that are critical to our society. How can we build trust in the research data process to ensure that decisions are made with the best possible information? And can cyber infrastructure be used to aid this process?
Absolutely. As we put together cyber infrastructures, and that's a confusing term because it's a very broad term, but you put together computing systems to manage that research workflow. But research objects are not like any other digital object. They actually have a context around them. In order to trust that research object, you need to understand that context around it and the metadata that support it. And it's really not alone. It has not only has the data itself, but it has code often. It has instruments that were used. It has workflows that the people use to use the instruments. So all of that is part of this research data workflow. And as you build the cyber infrastructures, you can't forget that it's a holistic unit that you're trying to manage. And I think that's how you begin to build trust. The other piece of trust is transparency, because you need to be sure everyone knows how you're putting these pieces together and where they came from.
Claudio, the university is the second home to most of our audience. What is the status of our data management cyber infrastructure? Is it new? Is it old? And most importantly, is it secure?
Well, we try to keep up with state of the art, and we are always trying to revamp and trying to put everything in terms that we can consider and we can use them as secure infrastructure. We have specific groups that deal with security in our university. Currently, we are also using the cybersecurity office for the university to be able to address some of the issues and some of the threats. The part of the security and the part of the aging of systems is something that is recurrent in universities throughout the country, and we are always investing and putting our best efforts in trying to have all the best infrastructures that we can have and that we can support. So most of the work that we do is related to providing researchers with the best tools to cope with the work and the research that they have to build, and that also means having them to get access to new technologies and to new services and to new servers also, so that their research can be done faster and then can be done more secure.
Jonathan, you mentioned this in the previous answer, but can cyber infrastructure be leveraged to help support research reproducibility and data management? Reproducibility is key to this question.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we think about science, the first thing we think of is that science is repeatable, that this is a process. You have controls into the system, and you know exactly what you have done, and then someone could repeat that process. So you can't have a scientific process that is untrusted. You need to be trusted. The challenge is, as we add more and more infrastructure and cyber infrastructure and tools and techniques, it gets much more complicated, and our skill sets of our community, researchers, you don't know everything. So you may have one person on the team that's a specialist in this instrument, and you may have another statistical person on the team. Teams are much more multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary these days. So it's hard for one person to have that entire knowledge, which means you need to be able to manage that workflow and come up with ways that you can have that workflow encapsulated into some sort of a system. So you don't just store the data, you store that environment and that workflow, whether that be Jupyter notebooks, Python-based lab notebooks, or using things like Docker or Singularity containers to encapsulate around that research process, and building things and tools that help researchers encapsulate their research so they can share it with another researcher, and that researcher doesn't have to spend hours figuring out how to redo the experiment. They can just rerun that, and then they can gain evidence that this was a very transparent process. There are tools out there that can be put together to build these. Unfortunately, today, they're all separate. They're different tools. What we need to do is stitch them together into this cyber infrastructure and then put user interfaces on top of that, so researchers, archivists, curators, and librarians can use those to help describe that workflow and share it with other groups.
Yeah. So, for both of you, the question, we've been talking about cyber infrastructures, but why should we be concerned about them? So, most people just access them through web page, portal. They have no clue what's behind that. Can you talk a bit about what's behind the curtain?
Well, behind the curtain you have a multitude of systems, as we were talking about, and you have, most importantly, a multitude of policies. Because if we want to have our data secure, and if we want to be able to share it and to use it in the means that they were meant to be used, and to give them other means for other researchers to use it and to figure out new things, we have to be able to figure out all the policies and to be able to put together a multitude of systems that are in place, so that the users can do what they want to do with data, but the data is still considered secure, so that myself as a researcher, I feel confident of sharing my data using that service. Otherwise, I won't do it. I won't use it, and that's the most important aspect. And everything that's behind the storage and the Dockers and all that, the Python notebooks and all that, they're just tools to help data to be shared and to be put using the correct policies at the hands of the researchers. That's pretty much it. So.
Absolutely, and you mentioned policies.
Yeah.
A lot of times when people think about cyber infrastructure, the first thing you think about is the technology.
No.
And I'm a technologist, right? and I love to talk about the cool technology, but it's really about the policies.
Yeah.
The technology just implements those policies. So, and some of the harder parts are coming up with those policies and working with the users and listening to those researchers, because it's a partnership with the researchers. You sit down, you listen what they need, you develop those policies, and then you look at the transparency, and then you look at the tools needed to use those. And in the end, the researcher really doesn't care whether you use Docker or Singularity, or you use OpenStack or VMware. They don't really care about that. They want to do their research, and they want to be able to repeat that research. And it's our jobs to be able to communicate with them and then build that infrastructure and layer a user interface on top that they can access that easily.
Yeah.
So you previously mentioned trusted repositories and the need to pass them on, but what does it mean for a repository to be trusted?
Yeah. So it's the word trust has a lot in it, and it's unpacking that word trust. For many years, libraries have been entrusted to keep our knowledge all the way back. In time, you go to the library. That's where you can find the books, the scrolls, the knowledge. Museums, they hold those things. But now, much of our knowledge is in research data. This research data is critically important, and libraries and archives have been embracing that. But it includes many things other than the technology. So trust, I would say that trust includes many components. And people talk about fair data these days. Fair data is a term you hear people talk about. Your data should be fair. It should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. Yeah, repeatable. Yeah. So that's true, absolutely true. And that's about that data object. But several colleagues of mine and I have been talking about an idea around trust, that the repository, the place that you put the data in the code, it needs to be trusted. And that trust can be broken down in a couple levels. The first is transparency. I mentioned it earlier. As long as you let the researchers know what you're doing and let everyone know your entire workflow processes, you can be transparent. The next thing you have to have is responsibility. Trust, responsibility. The R is responsibility. I take ownership of this data. Researchers won't have control of that data in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. Someone has to be responsible after those research projects are not funded anymore. So these institutions like archives and libraries and repositories, they have the ability to take that responsibility. So you have trust, you have responsibility, but the critical component that sits at the center of trust is users, the user community. Who is going to use that data? How will they use that data? What do they need to understand that data? Which level of education are these users at, as to how you have to describe that data? So the user community sits at the middle of trust. The next piece that is absolutely critical is sustainability. You have to be able to sustain this over time. And sometimes that spans not only institutions, but governments. It spans administrations in governments. And over time, things change. So if you're going to be sustainable, you have to have a business continuity model, not only for the technology and the software, but also for the business processes, for those policies, for the funding, to how you train your people over time, because critical people in your organization are going to retire. They're going to retire, they're going to move on, they're going to change jobs. How are you going to bring the next group of people on board that understand that research data well enough to manage it for that community going forward? And the last thing, and I call the last T purposefully technology, right? I'm a technologist. I could have put it first. Transparency first, technology is last. Technology supports all of these other things. And it's our job as technologists to build that supporting system.
Absolutely.
And that's what we do. We do best is we support the research. And these repositories and archives need to be trusted. And they're built on top of that technology, but there's much more that those policies and human interactions are really important. So just break those things down into TRUST, into trust, and that builds that world. And that's what I think of when I think of a trusted repository. And there are many great repositories around the world, but we all have a lot to learn, and we learn from each other. We communicate with folks all around the world doing this exact same types of preservation actions and same types of data. And we can learn from each other.
Absolutely.
I would like to expand this question to Claudia. So, how is our organization at the university building up these trust repositories?
Well, we are starting for the basis, so we're trying to figure out the policies at first, and afterwards, with the policies in place, start to talk with the researchers and try to figure out what their exact needs are in terms of the sustainability. So what kind of information are they going to gather in these repositories, and is it going to be a huge amount of information put there just once, or is it going to grow and to bigger and bigger and bigger amounts throughout the years? And with these key things in place, we can try to figure out what are the other parts and what are the technology parts that we have to implement to support their job and to support the usage of that information.
So I will open now some questions from the audience through the chat that we have live from our YouTube channel. So Silvino asks a question here: does more security mean less freedom to the public? I think this question can go to both of you.
Yeah.
It depends on what we are talking about, because at first we have to say absolutely. So more security means less freedom. But if we go further and further, and if we try to figure out what people want to do in terms of what they consider the freedom, I believe that we can figure out the correct policies and the correct things to put in place, the correct rules, so that researchers and the audience and the public can have access to the information that they require and that they need without compromising things that we consider as vital.
Yeah.
So it's a compromise at first, but we can always evolve and put things in a higher ground of negotiations, so that both parties can be more well suited with what we have.
And this approach has worked in many places all over the world. You start with those policies, you talk to the researchers, you figure out what are the requirements for these, and then you start looking at ways that you can provide access and more freedom to access the data without risking that security.
Yeah.
There are lots of new things happening, things like differential privacy, tools that use statistical methods to release data out into the world, but yet hold back enough information so you can't discover people's identity within the data.
Yeah.
Things like synthetic data or encryption of data, where you have secure multi-party computation, where neither party actually have all the data. A third party does the computation, and then you're not sharing the data, you're just sharing the results of that data. So there are lots of methods, but the first thing you have to understand is the policy behind each individual data set.
Absolutely.
Each researcher is different, each research project is different. There is no template that you could use for all of them.
No one fits all size.
No, no.
So we'll have one more question, and then we can finish this time talk. And I will have a very open question. This is a question for both, of course, which based on our reliance on technology, and we're all technologies guys here. Since we rely so much on technology, has it made our society stronger or weaker? And I'm thinking about ways technology has recently been used to subvert society. Things like fake news, conspiracy theories, like just flat earth, vaccines, climate change. And we've been discussing here how these repositories, they contain both the truth and the fake data. So how are we possibly going to manage what gets stored? Sometimes we might be storing a lot of trash, no?
I think that's a tricky question for.
It's a philosophic question. It's mostly a philosophic question.
Yeah, because I would say that it depends actually, because I can do my research in terms of fake news, and so everything that I store in my data sets is absolutely fake news, and I can put the title and I can put some meta information that says this is fake news, or I can see no, this is information that I've collected, and the way that I do that as a researcher, it's kind of independent from the archive themselves. So. And the things that I'm collecting and things that I'm cataloging by myself, they might be a little bit too specialized for the archivists to understand them at their full meaning, and to be able to understand if that is correct or incorrect information. So if it's fake information or if it's correct information to the audience, and that can mislead the uninformed user and the uninformed user of that data. But one thing that it's important is that with all the things that have been happening, there is, despite all the information and all the incorrect information that is being shared throughout the social media and not only there, I believe that there is a bigger and bigger community that is more aware of these issues and things that probably also happened before in smaller groups with social relations, not with the big media social. They probably are now seen with a different eye from the receiver of that information, because probably they remember, so there are fake news out there, so probably this might or may not be a fake news also. So I would say that the technology makes us better unless we use it on the wrong way, and then it makes us worse.
I'm also trying to refer to the fact that we have retracted articles, retracted studies, but we keep storing. And what are we doing about that? Do we have the means to police those stuff? Are archivists knowledge enough about what is in there? Because many of the times these fake news and conspiracies are based on scientific data that was collected and not properly curated.
Yeah. So it sometimes is not so black and white either. So if it's fake news, it's falsified news. But it's also the potential that it's all true. It's just from a different perspective. Yeah. Because each of us have our own biases. And when we talk about data, we inherently look at things that we're interested in. And we inherently don't look at the things we're not interested in. And unfortunately, as human beings are, we talk about the stuff we like. And we try to use and leverage that data. So I think it's not quite yes or no, good or bad. It's this perspective that we need to have. And I actually think it starts not with technology, but it starts with educating us. It's so easy to pick up the phone and do Google, right? And you can look at the top 2 or 3 things, and they know that you're going to see the top ones. But there's an algorithm for that, and what's behind that algorithm is who pays the most money, is how you get there. I know that. I understand that, but many people do not. So what we need to do is educate our students, educate our communities, our politicians, in order to think about data and think about studies, critically look at it. Which perspective is this data coming from? Who collected this data? Who is using it and how are they using it? To question those things, to think about it critically. Don't just pick up the computer or the app or the tool and accept what it does. Think critically about that and then make your decision. As humans, we do this all the time, right? You have people you meet and you really get along with, and you can trust this person. You have that feeling, right? It's hard to do that with a computer, right? Very, very hard to do that. So we have to learn to educate ourselves on how to trust these things. So you leverage that technology appropriately, and it begins with teaching our students how to do that, and then teaching our society.
Okay, that's very good answers. So we're down to our final minutes. Thank you both for participating, and we also thank the support of the US Embassy in Lisbon. And the next Any Talk will happen in the next week, and we will be about video games with Ernest Adams, founder of the International Game Developers Association. So stay tuned to our social media networks to attend the next talk, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.